Imagine living in a remote location far north near the Arctic Circle, where electricity depends on a winter road that only exists for a few weeks each year. That road is the only way to bring fuel and the supplies into the community. If it doesn't form, fuel has to be flown in at enormous cost. Welcome to Power Unplugged. I'm your host, Sufia Khalid, and I'm thrilled to launch this podcast, a space where we explore the real world challenges of reducing diesel dependence and introducing clean energy in some of the most remote and extreme environment on the planet. Each episode, I will be speaking with engineers, planners, and the community leaders who are doing this work on the ground, where technology, climate, and community all come together. My very first guest is Leo. Leo has over 30 years of experience in the Canadian consulting industry and leads the building electrical engineering group at Stantec in Winnipeg. He is an award-winning lighting designer and has been deeply involved in the design of hybrid energy system for off-grid indigenous community in northern Canada, places where failure is not an option. One of those community is Sayisi Dene First Nation, located at Tadoule Lake, Manitoba, a fly-in settlement near the Arctic Circle that has historically relied entirely on diesel power. Leo, welcome to the podcast. It is wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Sophia. I'm happy to share my experience, and as you mentioned, renewable energy was not my original specialty. But in 2021, a client approached us with a request to conduct a feasibility study for a renewable energy plant. And prior to that, my focus was entirely on designing electrical systems for buildings, and it still is. But this particular request was so intriguing and fascinating that I just couldn't resist. So I took the lead of the project and have been coordinating it ever since. And I'm working closely with our specialist colleagues in Stantec, Ontario offices. They handle conditions analysis, software simulation, technical design, and I've been acting as the engineering project manager on this project. Sayisi Dene First Nation is a small indigenous community of about 350 people. And as you mentioned, it's located in a settlement called Tadoule Lake. It's just south of the Arctic Circle at the very northern edge of the province of Manitoba, which is a geographical center of Canada. In fact, actually of the continent, because there is an area in southern Manitoba which is equidistant from all ocean coast. There are no permanent roads connected to Tadoule Lake. And normally the only way to access that community is by air. However, during the coldest winter months, a temporary winter road is built on packed snow and ice. And that winter road lasts for several weeks and becomes once in a year opportunity to receive bulk shipments. All equipment that they're going to need, construction materials, and critically all of the diesel fuel they're going to need for the entire year. And anything that cannot be transported over that winter road must be airlifted, and that comes at a very high cost. And in some cases, it's simply not practical to airlift such things as heavy equipment.
Leo, that really helps to understand the circumstances there. And I think what stands out immediately is that this is not just a story about an energy infrastructure. It's a story about an access, isolation, logistic, and everyday reliability. Because when a community depends on a winter road for its fuel supplies, electricity, becomes much more than just something that powers the life. So, before we get into the technical side of the project, I want to start with the fundamentals. What does being off grid truly means for the community like Sayisi Dene First Nation? Not just technically, but in terms of day to day life.
I'll start by saying that in Manitoba, almost all energy is generated by Manitoba Hydro. It's provincial run public utility, and Manitoba Hydro operates an extensive power grid across the province. Generation is drawn mostly entirely from hydroelectric stations on provincial rivers system. And as a result, Manitoba offers some of the lowest energy rates in Canada and arguably lowest in the world if you remove government subsidies and other market interventions. However, there are 4 remote communities at the very northern edge of the province that are not connected to this grid. These communities receive their power from small local diesel generating stations, and as you can imagine, the cost of energy in these locations is many times higher than elsewhere in the province. Tadoule Lake is one of these communities. All materials, including the annual diesel fuel supply, are transported via the winter road. With a changing climate, winter road seasons have been growing shorter and less reliable. And while it's rare, there have been instances where the winter road failed to form altogether during a particularly short and warm winters. When that happens, a state of emergency is declared because the community faces the risk of losing not only its electricity supply, but also its heating, since diesel fuel is used for both. And in those situations, fuel must be airlifted at an extreme cost. Beyond the logistical vulnerability, diesel dependence brings well-known environmental challenges such as air pollution, operating noise, and the need for large fuel storage tank farms, which are prone to leaks, and those leaks can cause serious environmental damage and are very costly to remediate.
Okay, let's really put the scale of the challenge into perspective, because what you are describing is not just an expensive energy system. It's a fragile one, a system where climate, fuel access, reliability, and environmental risk are all tightly connected. And I think that naturally leads to a next question. If diesel dependence creates so many vulnerabilities, what does a better system start to look like? Where team worked on reducing that dependence by integrating solar PV and battery energy storage system. Now I think for a lot of listeners the immediate reaction might be solar in northern Manitoba. So why did the solar still make sense for Tadoule Lake?
Despite the extreme temperatures and long winters that we experience in northern Canada, these communities actually receive a surprisingly high amount of solar exposure. And in fact, solar panels and inverters tend to perform better in cold temperatures. The cold actually helps their efficiency, while solar PV cannot be relied upon solely and that's because of the time of day limitations, weather variability, and seasonal changes in northern latitudes. But still, it has significant potential to offset a meaningful portion of diesel generation. Solar panels have no moving parts, they last a long time, and they require minimal maintenance. All of those qualities make them particularly well suited to remote locations, such as Tadoule Lake, where locally available skill sets for operating and maintaining complex equipment are very limited. Having a simple, low-maintenance technology like solar is a real advantage in these communities. The renewable energy contribution could be increased more if you add a wind generation. Unlike solar, which is constrained by daylight hours, seasonal variations in such northern latitudes, wind blows year-round, day and night. The challenge with wind, however, is that it significantly increases both the construction complexity and the operational complexity of the renewable plant. And that places a higher demand on the local support labor. This is why solar is the logical first step. It is the lower hanging fruit, easier to implement, and wind could be a potential future phase. Finding appropriately sized wind turbines for smaller scale off-grid applications, ones that can address the logistical challenges of remote northern construction and have been proven in extreme climatic conditions. It's also a sourcing challenge just in itself. And one of the greatest engineering challenges that we observed when adding renewable generation and off-grid locations is making it work reliably alongside the existing diesel plant. Solar is an intermittent energy source. Its output fluctuates continuously in response to environmental changes. And within a matter of seconds, the output can drop from 100% to near zero. And that means that diesel generators must constantly respond to these fluctuations and compensate by modulating their own generation. Many remote generating stations are equipped with older control systems, and they require substantial upgrades and complex control algorithms to maintain system stability and reliability once renewable generation is added. And there is another significant challenge. The intermittent nature of solar requires diesel engines to maintain what is called a spinning reserve, which means continuously running diesel engines ready to fill in any sudden drop in solar output. A spinning diesel engine requires a minimum load of 30 to 40% of its rated capacity to avoid engine degradation. Given that these engines are deliberately oversized for reliability reasons, that minimum loading constraint leaves relatively little headroom for solar to contribute meaningfully. However, there is a solution to most of these challenges, and that's the addition of battery energy storage system, or BESS. Essentially, it's a large battery that acts as a buffer between the solar array and the grid, and it allows the full solar output to be captured and stored. When the battery is adequately charged, the diesel engine can be completely shut down and the community load transferred entirely to BESS. Microgrid control system continues to monitor the battery state of charge, and at any moment it detects that the charge is dropping and solar cannot sustain it, it will automatically bring back diesel engines online. This approach maximizes the effectiveness of solar, minimizes diesel fuel consumption, and enhances overall grid stability and reliability.
That's such a fascinating explanation. And I think it really challenges a lot of assumptions people have about renewable energy in northern climates. Because what you have made very clear is that the real challenge is not simply whether solar can work in a place like Tadoule Lake. It's how to make solar work reliably inside a system that still has to keep the lights on every second of the day. And that's where the engineering gets really sophisticated. So I want to dig a little deeper into the design process. First, how did your team model the variability of the solar generation? And how did you size the BESS to ensure adequate reliability during winter months when sunlight is most limited?
At this stage, we're not targeting complete displacement of diesel generation. That's just not practical yet, and we don't yet have sufficient operational experience with renewable systems in specific northern context, remote communities, to do so with confidence. Perhaps in the future, but for now, the goal is to reduce diesel consumption as much as possible while staying within the fiscal and logistical constraints of this project. To extend solar effectiveness into the winter months, we made arrangements with the local community to clear snow from the panels. We're also using bifacial solar panels, which capture not only direct sunlight, but also light reflected off the snow, and that reflected light can be surprisingly high contribution. Despite these measures, majority of power during winter season is still expected to come from the diesel plant. In terms of BESS sizing, we did not size it for 24-hour standalone reliability. We sized it to maximize the effectiveness of solar generation and extract the greatest possible output from it. And that said, due to market conditions and equipment availability, we ended up with BESS quite a bit larger than originally designed, which actually gives us greater storage capacity than initially anticipated. At the feasibility study stage of the project, we obtained several years of hour-by-hour community load profile data. We loaded that data into specialty optimization software for modeling multiple energy resources, and then simulated the existing diesel plant augmented with various combinations of solar, wind, and BESS. The result was a recommended renewable plant scale and configuration. And our initial recommendation actually included both solar and wind generation. However, due to complexities and constraints I described earlier, wind has been deferred to a potential future phase. And for now, we're proceeding with solar and BESS. And those two components have been scaled up from the initial design and are now advancing into construction phase. In fact, the equipment and most of materials have just been shipped via winter road to the project site in Tadoule Lake. Manitoba Hydro ran a temporary power service to the site, and that service will allow us to maintain the required temperature to preserve the batteries of the BESS. And now we're waiting for the long subarctic winter to be over so that the construction can proceed.
Okay, that's really insightful. And I think that the distinction is so important because what you are describing is not a system designed to eliminate diesel overnight. It's a system designed to reduce dependence intelligently in a way that is realistic for the community, the climate, and the operational constraint on the ground. And I think that's such an important engineering mindset, not designing for a perfect theoretical solution, but designing for something that is actually practical, reliable, and buildable. What's also really interesting is that once you start layering solar storage and diesel together, the challenge is no longer just about a generation. It becomes a question of how the whole system behaves moment to moment. So that brings me to my next question, which is about system stability. How did your team approach voltage and frequency control within the microgrid, especially given the inherently variable nature of the solar as an intermittent energy source?
In the current design, the diesel plant remains the primary source of power for the community. The microgrid is not designed for what's called the black start. That is, the ability to restart the entire grid from a completely de-energized state using only renewables. The expectation is that the diesel plant will come online first, form the grid, establish the reference frequency and voltage, and once that grid is stable and the microgrid control detects adequate renewable energy supply, then it takes the grid over and maintains its frequency and voltage as it was set by the diesel plant. And that allows the diesel engines to be shut down for as long as conditions allow. And the microgrid control system will continuously monitor grid stability, power quality, system faults, and available renewable capacity. If any of these parameters fall outside preset threshold, it will automatically bring the diesel engines back online to retake supply and maintain stability of the system.
That's really a helpful explanation because it shows that the diesel system is still doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it's come to grid stability, even as renewables and storage start to play much bigger role. And I think that's such an important point for our listeners. The challenge here is not just generating cleaner power. It's doing it in a way that keeps the system stable and dependable at all the times. Now layered on the top of all, what that control complexity is the environmental reality where the system actually has to operate. So I want to talk a little about the physical conditions themselves. How does an extreme cold weather affects the batteries, the control systems, and the long-term reliability of the installation overall?
Electronics, interestingly, perform better in cold environments. The colder the better in general. The challenges associated with extreme temperatures are not primarily related to the electronic components themselves, but rather to water condensation and certain materials becoming brittle at low temperatures. Solar panels and inverters have been successfully deployed and operated in extremely cold climates, and there is now extensive operational confidence in their performance. The BESS is more sensitive component. Batteries must be maintained within prescribed temperature range to prevent premature degradation or failure. And the battery systems we're using on our project are supplied with as a pre-assembled unit with protective enclosure, and that enclosure has been specifically engineered for these climatic conditions. It's insulated, ventilated, heated, and there is an integrated environmental control system that will maintain the interior conditions at the levels that are required for batteries to operate reliably throughout the year.
That's a great explanation. I think it really helps demystify the idea that the coal itself is not the problem, when actually it's a more about managing the batteries. Now, beyond the technical side of the things, there is really an important human element to this project. I would like to talk a bit about the role of the community. How has Sayisi Dene First Nation been involved and what has that partnership looked like in practice?
And the project was a community-led initiative from the very beginning. Sayisi Dene First Nation has been closely involved in its development at every stage. The community formed a dedicated organization, the Sayisi Dene Renewable Energy Corporation, or SDRE, which is leading and overseeing this project. And the chief of the First Nation at the time, Evan Yassi, personally took the helm of that organization. He was deeply invested in this initiative, having previously been involved in operating diesel plant himself. And his intimate familiarity with the existing system was quite invaluable in working through many of the technical details. Evan later stepped down as the chief of the First Nation, but he remained president of SDRE and continues to be actively involved. And the incoming chief and council have maintained strong support for this project and have stayed closely engaged throughout. We have conducted regular progress reporting to the community, and we had several formal community engagement sessions. Those are sessions in which we explained the project, outlined what the community should expect, and we welcomed questions from elders and community members. We worked to address all concerns raised, including those related to visual and environmental impact of wind turbines on traditional practices, such as caribou hunting. The project also carries important economic significance. Employment opportunities in the community of Tadoule Lake are extremely limited, and involvement with modern technology is almost non-existent. The renewable plant is expected to create some local employment in operation and maintenance. It's not going to generate a large number of jobs, but it will create some meaningful ones. It is also hoped that the project will inspire young people to remain in the community and contribute to its technological future. It's also important to acknowledge the critical role of Manitoba Hydro in making this project viable. Their support and commitment have been remarkable. Manitoba Hydro's agreement to take responsibility for operating the most complex microgrid components was one of the most important factors in moving this project from concept to reality, and particularly given the very limited technical resources available locally.
That's a really powerful example of what true partnership looks like, especially with a level of community, leadership, and involvement you have described. Before we wrap up, I would like to shift into a quick rapid fire round. Just a few brief questions to start us off. What one area you think engineers working on remote microgrid projects should explore more deeply?
The operating logic and reliability engineering of power plants, for me it was genuinely surprising to discover how complex the control logic needed to be. Managing the transitions between diesel generation and renewable sources, sequencing multiple generating units, ensuring stability throughout those transitions. It caught me off guard when I engaged in this project. I'm deeply grateful to have had genuine experts involved in every discussion between the manufacturer, the utility, the microgrid designers. My strong recommendation, develop a thorough understanding of that operating logic. It is absolutely critical.
That's really valuable takeaway, especially around how complex the control and operating logic can be behind the scenes. Building on that, what lesson you learned the hard way on this project?
Understanding the cost structures specific to northern remote communities and designing accordingly from the outset. The practical realities in construction in these locations can be dramatically different from similar projects in the South. When we received the first cost estimates after completing our initial design concepts, the numbers were genuinely shocking. Concrete cast in place in the community can cost up to 10 times more than in the South, and that's without exaggeration. That forced us to fundamentally rethink our approach. We adapted the design to precast foundation components in advance and shipped them over winter road. That's a critical lesson for any future projects of this type. Understand the logistical and cost environment before you begin to design and not after.
That's a powerful lesson and a great reminder how different the realities on the ground can be compared to initial assumptions. On that note, what's the one thing you think textbooks simply don't prepare engineers for?
Communicating technical complexity to non-technical audiences in such a way that is clear, accurate, and it's not intimidating. When I was presenting to the community and an elder asked me how noisy the wind turbines would be, and I had to explain what 52 decibels on the logarithmic scale actually means in such terms that were meaningful and reassuring, I had to be genuinely creative. I found a way to do it, and it worked very well. But technical schools do not teach us that. They teach us physics and engineering principles, but translating those into language that resonates with a person from a completely different background, that's a skill we have to develop ourselves through experience.
That's such an important skill. Being able to translate complex idea into something meaningful and relatable really makes all the difference. On a more personal note, what inspired you to become an engineer?
My father, he was a mechanical engineer, and he designed equipment for clothing and garment industry, specializing in fur and leather fabrication. He was an inventor. He had held a number of patents, and I grew up surrounded by engineering drawings. So when I eventually studied engineering myself, I found that I could read and interpret technical drawings far more naturally than most of my peers. And for me, it was just like reading music. My career actually began working alongside my father, and he hoped at the time that I would inherit his specialty. But like most young people, I wanted to chart my own course. So I was drawn to electrical engineering. And my father, to his great credit, did not hold me back. But the irony is that life has come full circle. My younger son has just begun his engineering studies, and he is going into mechanical engineering, not electrical. And unfortunately, my father is no longer with us, but I have no doubt that he would have had a good chuckle if he found out about that.
That's wonderful, especially how your father gave you the freedom to find your own path. And now seeing that legacy come full circle with your son. I can really relate to that. In my family, my father is a civil engineer and my brother followed the same path, while I ended up being only electrical engineer. So I understand that balance between influence and individuality within an engineering family. Building on that, who would you say has influenced your professional career the most, and why?
I would say my first boss in Canada. I received my electrical engineering degree from St. Petersburg University in Russia, where I was born and raised. And after graduated, I worked there for a couple of years before immigrating to Canada in 1989. Most of my fellow immigrants at the time, regardless of their academical backgrounds and professional experience, they began their careers in Canada by doing low-skilled labor, hoping that one day they might return to their field. Some of them did, many did not, and I was fortunate. I was young, relatively fresh from university, and I managed to secure my first job in or close to my field. I joined a small four-person engineering firm doing electrical design for buildings. I joined as a junior drafter on minimum wage, and building design was not actually my academic background. I was trained in power systems analysis and have never touched buildings electrical design before. But I learned quickly, and it did not matter to me because I was in engineering. I was happy. That first Canadian job defined the entire trajectory of my career. I'm still designing buildings today. And my first Canadian boss had an unusual and powerful combination. He had trained as an electrician, spent some time in construction, and then obtained an engineering degree and co-founded that small firm where I started. And he would consistently arrive at engineering solutions that most conventionally trained engineers would never have considered. Unorthodox, creative, effective. He was the person who taught me not to think linearly when solving a project, not to hesitate to venture into unfamiliar territory. Of everyone I've worked with in my career, I probably learned the most from him. Although I should add, honestly, that I also had to unlearn some of what he taught me, because as resourceful as he was as an engineer, his business practices and communication style were not always what I would recommend. And I consciously moved away from some of those approaches after leaving that firm. I guess learning what not to learn is also part of professional development. And but despite all of that, he was still had the most profound impact on my career.
Okay, that's really interesting, especially how he encouraged you to think in unconventional ways and explore solutions beyond the typical path. And I appreciate your honesty about learning what not to do. That's such a real and often overlooked part of growth. It really highlights how valuable it is to stay open, adapt, and shape your own approach over time.
That's precisely. I often call it the walking calculator problem. You can plug in formulas, size equipment, follow your textbooks, and the computer can do it all and probably better. What a truly capable engineering mind excels at is stepping outside of that framework, applying creativity and abstract thinking to arrive at solutions that are beyond the standard playbook. Now that I mentor young engineers myself, that's what I try to teach them.
I really like that, the idea of moving beyond being a walking calculator and develop that creative, abstract way of thinking. And it's a great to hear how you are now passing that mindset on to others through mentorship. On that note, as we start to wrap up, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Do not lock yourself into your specialty. Be courageous. Be willing to cross disciplinary boundaries. Take the time to understand how other engineering disciplines function. and I mean structural, civil, mechanical, architecture, environmental science, and other relevant fields, how they operate, and what drives the decisions that they make. You don't need to become an expert in all of those. It's just not realistic. But developing fluency across those parallel fields will make you a significantly stronger engineer in your own discipline and will make you far better at collaborating. When I began my career, I did not appreciate that. I was focused narrowly on my own domain, and it was only when I left my first place and moved to a larger firm where I started working side by side with engineers from other disciplines every day. That's when I began to understand how much better I became as an engineer by understanding their world, how to adapt my own practices to make their life easier, and how they can adapt theirs to improve mine. And that's my strongest recommendation for any young engineer starting out today.
It's such a valuable advice, especially the importance of staying curious and open beyond your own discipline. It really ties back to everything we have discussed today. This conversation has been a powerful reminder that energy is never just about technology. It's about people, their resilience, their daily lives, and the reliability of the system they depend on. And your insights really brought that to life. From your early experiences to the way you approach engineering and mentorship today. Leo, thank you for sharing your journey and for giving us a deeper look into what it really takes to design a system in such a complex and demanding environment. Your work is clearly making a meaningful impact, and to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. I will see you in the next episode of Power Unplugged with the new challenges, new projects, and more stories from the field.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.